Thanks so much, Hani, and thanks for the invitation to join you all today. So I am going to be presenting a study for you that we recently completed, and you are the very first to hear the results. So we put together this study at UCITS, so that's the University of California's Institute of Transportation Studies. So it represents 4 campuses to assess what states across the nation were doing in terms of their strategic and policy initiatives related to automated vehicles to provide guidance and lessons learned specifically for the state of California. But the lessons learned can be transferred to any part of the United States or any part of the world. So I also have the pleasure of serving as the director of the California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative on behalf of the UCITS campuses. So that's Berkeley, Davis, Irvine, and UCLA. And this initiative is really focused on looking at innovative mobility and fostering resiliency. And this work was completed by myself and Stephen Wong, who is my soon-to-be graduating doctoral student. So today I want to present the findings of this result or this report with you, including the methods that we employed, some of the results themselves, our takeaways, what California might consider doing, and then also giving you some insights into some tracking that I've been doing with respect to automated vehicles and COVID-19. So this work is funded by SB1, and for those of you in California, you probably know what this is. So this is part of our Road Repair and Accountability Act measure, and we are able to advance research on behalf of the state through this funding. And so that's why it takes a very strong policy focus as well as a very strong California focus. So I'm probably not going to spend too much time here setting the backdrop for this because I'm sure any event focused on automation and autonomous vehicles has done this, but there's a growing realization around these vehicles, and governments are now authorizing testing, taking on issues associated with liability, safety, and also assessing the economic benefits. And there's many benefits associated with this technology, which is why people are racing to deploy it, including reducing fatalities and incidents, smoothing the traffic flow, increasing our economic productivity. You see truck platooning here, lowering our energy use, riding the green wave, if you will, decreasing our parking needs and improving accessibility, along with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But there's also potential disadvantages, increasing vehicle miles traveled, energy use, and greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of there being a utopia and a dystopia of AVs, and this sort of paints that picture of automation, taking us in the dystopian direction, taking people away from critical mass transit services, leading to more dispersed land use and development patterns, potentially compromising our privacy and security, and increasing costs overall for infrastructure, and reducing labor and employment opportunities. So many things that have to be addressed from a policy standpoint. Our conclusion after reviewing 51 actions across the United States was that California in particular lacks a holistic AV policies. So California is in there and definitely working in a lot of ways, but despite passing 18 bills or having pending legislation, there's no systematic policy strategy across the board. So our concern in doing this analysis is that one hand may be undoing the benefits of what another hand may be doing. There was a bill proposed in 2018 by Senator Allen, 2018, SB 59. And that was to have the California Transportation Commission form an advisory committee focused on autonomous vehicle technology. And this did not pass, and it has since expired. So there's a need potentially for more of this type of multi-stakeholder advancement. The Department of Motor Vehicles and the California Public Utilities Commission are both leading efforts, but they're more piecemeal. An example of that is the California Multi-Agency Working Group on AVs. And as I mentioned, there's possibilities for duplicative work or even policy conflicts without a more holistic coordination strategy. So what motivated us to do this was really two big questions. Are governments doing? What are they doing to prepare for AVs? And what can we learn to maximize AVs' potential benefits while minimizing their negative impacts through public policy making? So we set about reviewing state-level policy, collecting state-level policy for about a 5-year period between 2014 and 2019. And we collected this data over the course of about a 3-month period. And it included a wide variety of actions, including legislation, state agency actions, as well as executive orders originating from the governor's offices across the states. We also reviewed databases, the National Conference of State Legislatures, state departments of transportation websites, newspaper articles, and other types of search engines. So what we came away with was a total of 51 forums and actions. It was difficult to come up with a terminology for categorizing these, but if you look at this table, you'll see to the left that these forums or strategic actions are named out specifically in those rows. And you can see the states that are pursuing those actions to the right, as well as the total number. So you can see there's 12 committees across the states in DC, task forces, programs, and working groups, and less so in terms of initiatives, commissions, councils, and studies overall. Then we mapped these activities across the United States, as you can see here, and we show that there's a total of 51 actions. And what I want to caution you at is that this does not coincide with each of the states. That's more of a coincidence that there are 51 actions. But what you can see here is activities color-coded by legislature, which is your blue, your yellow, which is your executive branch, so your governor, multiple actions in the dark blue, and the gray representing a state agency's actions. So you can see they're scattered about the United States, and the highest numbers occur in the N of 15, and the light gray is no action whatsoever in the area of AV policy. So there's a number of strategic actions by body and by region. So what you can see here through these pie charts is the actions by legislation, which is the most popular here in the pie chart to the left, followed by state legislation and then governor actions. And then when we look across the United States, what we started to do was also analyze actions according to the regions in the US. And you can see 13 actions here in the South, 15 in the West, 12 in the Midwest. And the report itself will give you a breakdown of the states that we categorize in each of those particular regions. So some of the key takeaways are here. So what you can see here is that the most actions tend to focus from a government's perspective on safety, infrastructure, followed by insurance and liability. You can also see actions in the areas of registrations and licensing, law enforcement, collisions and crashes, as well as emergency response. Many of these actions also focus on the AV adoption process, and the vast majority here, representing over 60%, are in the area of testing. So pilot program testing, followed by operations and implementation and deployment. And we also tracked a number that related specifically to the economy. And you can see at the top rankings here, highlighted in the red, are economic development, workforce employment, and training. And then with respect to technology development itself was a leading factor, followed by data management and cybersecurity and privacy. And then when we look at the social and the environmental impacts of AV technology, you can see that the numbers are more dwindling overall. And the highest category is social equity and accessibility. A lot of this having to do with the American Disabilities Act. So now I'm going to go through some of the key takeaways by these histograms that I've presented. So the first is related with the fact that the primary focus of the forums and the strategic actions, not surprisingly, I think, are safety, testing, and infrastructure. This was especially the case for both Southern and Midwestern states, while testing seems to be emphasized more in the Northeast and the Western states. Many of the state actions, especially in the Midwest and the South, place a strong emphasis on AV economic benefits to the state. However, states across the US are less prepared for the overall changes that are going to come from the workforce changes. And on average, states place only moderate emphasis on AV adoption itself, that process. And that's something that we thought was really interesting, is not thinking so much about the systematic process itself of rolling out these vehicles. And that emphasis, of course, differs based on the region. States also place less emphasis on AV implications for the consumer or the traveler themselves. And this includes everything from data sharing to insurance and registration and cybersecurity. And since this doesn't get as much focus as safety and economic development, there's the potential for consumer protection issues to arise in the future if more emphasis is not placed in that area. AV implications in terms of the environment, social equity, goods movement, land use, and emergency response are only associated with more comprehensive statewide AV actions. And we thought that was an interesting finding. In fact, they tend to generate more from a governor's office, for example. And few states are considering automated vehicle connections or connectivity, multimodal connections to public transit and shared mobility services, along with these platforms, mobility on demand or mobility as a service, urban air mobility systems, as well as public health. In this next slide, I want to show you an emphasis on initiating body. And you can see here that the lines are represented as such. So a state agency such as a Department of Transportation is represented in the gray, the legislature is represented in the blue, and the governor's office is represented in yellow. And the ends represent the number of actions in each of those categories. You can see from the state agency perspective, a big emphasis here is showing up in the area of safety. And when we look to the governor's office, you see sort of a more distributed focus or more holistic focus across the board, with the exception of operations. And then when we look to the legislature, more focus here on safety itself, and more focus again on workforce, labor, employment, training types of issues, which isn't terribly surprising at all. So I think I've already covered this a few times, is the executive orders tend to cover a broader range of issues in contrast to the state legislatures or the state agencies themselves. With respect to representation on these forums and the strategic actions with respect to their membership, we found that transportation represented the vast majority, but a more holistic view might be to bring in more affected or impacted stakeholders. And you can see in terms of the percentage of representation in these forums that they start to dwindle, particularly once you get into finance, justice, aging, health and human services. And there's more representation in the areas of public safety, insurance, technology, motor vehicles, and highway patrol. In terms of state leadership, we often see a lot of focus on the legislative body and branch having representation in these forums, so elected representatives, and a little less so by the governor's office itself. Then we also look at academia. Academia is actually pretty well represented on these forums at over 50%. In terms of industry, a little bit less so in terms of the technology and communications experts, along with automakers and manufacturers in the industry. When we look to local and regional entities, we see much more involvement across city, county, and metropolitan planning organizations, in contrast to those public transit agencies. And that showed up in some of my earlier remarks. And then with respect to non-governmental organizations, we see more representation among motorist services like AAA, the League of Cities, and labor, in contrast to non-governmental organizations, environmental justice, aging, and disability. So some of the key takeaways from this in terms of representation is that the AV forums and strategic actions most often include officials from state departments of transportation, state legislators, and academics and researchers. So good representation in those areas. Many state departments and agencies are involved in the forums and bodies, indicating coordination and integration for some, but not all actions. So again, some of those actions that we saw predominantly across the board include things like safety. Industry is somewhat represented, but this indicates AV economic development and public-private partnerships could receive more consideration moving forward. And many organizations, state agencies, and groups not included in the 33 AV forums and bodies with members suggest important interests may not be represented in policy development. So a more holistic view is recommended. And then moving on here, we've got similar coding. I'll walk through that again with you. So we've got state agencies here in terms of the percent of representation on these forums by state agencies in the gray. And here in the gray, you see, like, for example, the University of California would fall here with almost 100% representation, representation on these forums, state departments of transportation, and local regional governance in those bodies. So those are ones initiated by state agencies. In terms of the legislature, we see state departments of transportation factoring there along with state legislators. So we're seeing more involvement in those categories, which has been playing out throughout this analysis. And then with respect to the governor's office in those executive orders, we see high levels of involvement of the State Department of Transportation, somewhat in the areas of commerce, and also in the area of Department of Motor Vehicles. So some key takeaways from all of this is that legislative actions are more likely to require a stakeholder forum or strategic actions to include members and or advisors. And then governor-initiated actions tend to be more inclusive of key agencies and organizations and outside groups when they put their bodies together. And moving on to the initiating body itself. So in terms of AV products and outcomes. So you can see here an N of 15 in the gray, the state agencies. Let's take a look at that. Lots of activity in the area of regulation, as well as pilot programs isn't so surprising, stakeholder coordination and recommendations and finding, not so much in proposed legislation or law or investments, but in contrast with the legislative branch, we see a lot of activity in the area of required reports, findings, and proposed legislation. And then with respect to the initiating action of a governor, we see a lot of interest in the area of research, as well as coordination and required reporting and findings, and much less so in terms of legislation itself. So the takeaways from these products is that most actions require a report and or recommendations or findings. Most of these bodies are designed to propose new legislation and create new laws, along with reviewing new and potentially amending current laws. AV research pilots, stakeholder coordination, and industry partnerships and best practices are employed to prepare states for driverless vehicles. And AV products and outcomes differ by the initiating entity, with the AV actions driven by priorities in the legislature and integration across those state agencies. So in this histogram, we look at the percent of AV types of products by those regions in across the US. And you can see that there's a lot of focus, particularly in the area of required reports and recommendations and findings in the Northeast, followed here by the Midwest. And then another area where we see a lot of leadership coming from the Midwest is in the area of regulations. So we thought this was really interesting to look at. We found that California and the West Coast was factoring in almost every area, but not taking a leadership role in any of these particular areas. So again, these regions differed definitely in terms of their expected AV products. And this, I think, could result in incompatible laws across state borders, as well as across regions. So something to be aware of. We were also really curious about academic collaboration and representation on AV actions by states. And what you can see here is that when we map this out across the US, you see in the light blue, about 15 here where a single public university is represented. And then in the dark blue, multiple public universities represented in this category with a sample size of 10. And then the vast majority here in the gray is none at all. And then you can see multiple public and private universities represented here in the yellow category. So that's how these stakeholders are engaging with academia. So universities and academics are very actively involved in these actions, serving in a variety of roles, including task force and committees and councils, or partnering with AV entities on the research itself. So looking forward to policy options for California, coming out of this research, we thought California could benefit by creating an interagency multi-stakeholder committee or working group overall. Employing universities as third-party facilitators or conveners, and analyzing diversity of AV focus areas to better understand the full range of impacts, and making sure that we don't totally focus on one area and neglect others. We also thought that California could benefit from ensuring more diverse stakeholder representation across all of these actions, and developing a series of subcommittees in the forum to allow for greater input. So maybe expertise according to these particular focus areas. And adopting a multi-year forum approach, which also engages a variety of levels of governance, not just the state level, but also local and regional planning efforts. And also partnering with other Western states in terms of AV policymaking to build a strong coalition to facilitate more seamless regulations up and down the West Coast, perhaps to start, and building a longer-term economic competitiveness plan. So as I move to the end of the presentation, I wanted to share with you, we've been tracking since COVID-19 hit a number of really interesting automated vehicle pivots and actions. And here I just walk through some of them with you, which I think are quite interesting. Jacksonville, the Mayo Clinic example, this was one of the very first to be deployed in terms of shifting from their automated shuttle service for transporting individuals to helping with testing and supply materials for COVID. And then in Arizona, California, and Washington, D.C., we see expanded robot food delivery services in those areas, which allows for the delivery of groceries and hot foods up to about 20 pounds to eliminate human contact. In both California and Colorado, we saw the use of the KiwiBot, and that's been used to deliver sanitary supplies and hygiene products and masks. In terms of Virginia, we see the company Wing. They have been working with contact delivery with respect to packages containing both food and household goods. Optimus Ride in California has been delivering food to seniors via automated shuttles. In China, we've seen Neolix delivering medical supplies via vans in hardest hit areas in China. And also in China, Beidou delivered food via automated vans to healthcare workers, and Unity Drive delivered fresh fruits and vegetables to 15 communities in eastern China via cargo vans. So there's been a lot of interesting pivots. You can see a lot of this is shared types of deployments, either e-commerce delivery type of actions, or really just focusing on keeping people safe and getting foods delivered to them. So this is the report itself, and I'm happy to enter any questions that you might have on this presentation.